There is a habit in history of confusing empire with inevitability. We see roads, fortresses, centralized power, huge armies, and we assume the outcome before the fighting begins. We look at the Inca Empire stretching for more than 4,000 kilometers, commanding disciplined armies of tens of thousands, supported by roads, storehouses, decimal organization, and one of the most sophisticated state systems in the pre-Columbian Americas. And we assume that anything standing in its path must eventually yield. Then we look south, beyond the comfortable reach of imperial administration, toward the cold river frontier, where the land breaks, where the weather hardens, where clan loyalties matter more than royal decrees, and we find the people who refused the script. The transcript frames it with the right scale from the start. 80,000 warriors, the strongest army in America, facing tribes with no empire, no monumental stone capitals, no palaces of gold, and somehow the men without the empire win. That is the hook, but the deeper truth is harder and more interesting. This was not a single miracle battle. It was a long collision between two opposite ideas of power. On one side stood the Incas, masters of integration, logistics, hierarchy, and political absorption. On the other stood the Mapuche, decentralized, stubborn, war-shaped, and deeply uninterested in being improved by anyone else's empire. The clash between them would not end with a clean conquest or one glorious last stand. It would turn into a grinding lesson in the limits of administration, the dangers of imperial pride, and the strategic power of a people who have decided that survival without submission is worth any cost. To understand why the Incas failed in the south, we have to begin with why they had every reason to think they would succeed. Around 1460, A.E. Pachacuti had already transformed Cusco from a minor kingdom into the center of a vast and expanding state. His name, the transcript reminds us, means he who transforms the earth, and this was no empty title. In less than 30 years, he subdued people after people. The Chancas, the Lupacas, the Collas, and others whose incorporation turned the Inca realm from a local power into Tawantinsuyu, the empire of the four regions. But what made Pachacuti dangerous was not brute force alone. Empires that rely only on violence grow quickly and crack just as fast. The Incas had a method. First came diplomacy emissaries, with gifts, alliance offers, promises of protection, inclusion roads, irrigation, prestige, a place within the imperial order. For many societies, this was rational to accept. Local elites could remain in place. Tribute would be paid, yes, but in exchange came infrastructure and a place within the greatest political machine on the continent. If diplomacy failed, then came demonstration, disciplined armies, overwhelming numbers, methodical advance, crushing force. That two-step system had worked repeatedly because it gave subject peoples a choice between comfortable subordination and spectacular defeat. Most understood the arithmetic. The Inca army itself made that arithmetic frighteningly persuasive. The transcript emphasizes its decimal organization, and that detail matters. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 each under commanders in a carefully tiered structure. That is not just neat administration. It is military clarity. It means command can scale. It means huge bodies of men can move, camp rotate, and fight without dissolving into noise. It means an empire can sustain campaigns far from its core because it has already translated political order into battlefield order. Add to that the road system, the supply depots placed at intervals, the logistical intelligence required to move armies without starving them, and the Incas begin to look less like a tribal confederation and more like an organized war state. They fought with slings that could hurl stones, lethally bronze, star-headed maces, spears, axes, and above all, discipline. Men trained from childhood. Formations understood. Orders followed. Against less coordinated peoples, this system was devastating. When Pachacuti died and his son Topa Yupanqui took command, the machine did not slow. It became more ambitious. Topa looked south and saw unfinished business. According to the transcript, he assembled the largest campaign the empire had yet seen, more than 40,000 warriors, and marched toward the limits of the known world. This is important. He was not moving merely to punish a troublesome border. He was extending the logic of empire itself. Southward, always southward. And at first, the campaign behaved exactly as an imperial campaign is supposed to behave. The peoples in the north of what is now Chile were brought in. Some resisted, but the empire's numerical and organizational superiority overwhelmed them. Topa Yupanqui established fortresses, extended the Inca road, built tambos, pushed the frontier outward, and watched tribute begin to flow back to Cusco. Each success reinforced the same idea. The system works, the South is merely behind schedule. Resistance is only a question of sequence. That belief would become the hidden weakness of the entire campaign. Because empires often fail not when they are weak, but when long success narrows their imagination. Everything changed at the Mall River. Geography matters here because rivers are not just lines on maps. They are moments of decision. They force armies to reveal intention, shape movement, expose timing, and sometimes divide the force physically at exactly the point where the enemy wants it divided. On the far side of the river stood the Mapuche. The transcript is precise about what made them different from the peoples the Incas had already subdued. They had no king to bribe, no single ruler to seize, no capital to besiege, no administrative center, whose fall would mean general collapse. They were decentralized clans, each with its own leader, each capable of local initiative, and each embedded in a warrior culture that turned adult men into defenders, almost by default. This did not make them stronger than the Incas in terms of state capacity. It made them harder to break in the way empire prefers to break people. A centralized state can be cut at the head. A decentralized warrior society bleeds from many wounds and keeps fighting. That distinction is one of the central lessons of this war. The Incas did what they always did. They sent emissaries. Offers were made. The benefits of joining Tawantinsuyu were explained. Roads, Imperial protection, integration under the Sapa Inca, access to a greater order. With many peoples, that speech had been persuasive, or at least intimidating enough to open negotiation. The Mapuche listened, and then answered with contempt. The transcript renders their reply in language almost too clean to be literal, but the strategic meaning is unmistakable. Go back north. These lands are not for you. There will be no emperor here, no tribute, no submission. If you cross the Maule, you cross into death. That kind of answer matters because it tells us not simply that the Mapuche were brave, but that they had already grasped the ideological stakes. They understood the Incas were not offering coexistence. They were offering incorporation. Improvement under foreign command is still foreign command. Topa Yupanqui was stunned because no one had spoken to imperial power that way for a very long time. At that moment, he faced the classic frontier choice every expanding empire eventually confronts. Withdraw and admit that the empire has a limit, or punish defiance so brutally that the limit vanishes with the people who named it. Pride made the decision for him. What the Incas did not know was that the Mapuche had spent weeks doing what good frontier defenders always do against a powerful invader watching. They had studied how the Inca camp was laid out, how formations were built, how the army moved, how discipline functioned, where rhythm lived inside this foreign machine.
Column advances from camp to field.
And while they watched, they called neighboring clans, set aside rivalries, and unified under a war leader, a Toki. The transcript notes that his name did not survive clearly, but his strategy did. That too tells us something. States preserve names. Resisting societies often preserve methods. The chosen Toki was not selected merely for brute strength or youth. He was selected because he understood how to convert the Inca advantages into liabilities. That is what makes him formidable. Facing a superior enemy does not require matching his strengths. It requires deciding where his strengths cannot breathe. The night before the first great clash, the Inca camp was calm. Why would it not be? They had fought bigger armies. They had overcome mountain peoples, rebellious provinces, and stubborn enemies before. The expectation was routine. Cross the river, form lines. Apply force, absorb. Resistance, advance. For the Mapuche on the nearby hills, the same night carried a completely different meaning. They were not thinking in terms of preserving an imperial timetable. They were thinking in terms of denying conquest any stable foothold at all. Dawn came. The Inca army began to cross the Maule. The river was not deep at that season. Men waited in order. Commanders organized the line on the southern bank. Then, when around half the army had crossed, the trap closed. From the hills descended 20,000 Mapuche. The transcript says not in orderly ranked geometry, but in what it describes as a human avalanche. This is the first great tactical inversion of the war. The Incas depended on form. The Mapuche attacked form itself. The Incas tried to build their classic defensive arrangement slingers, forward spearmen in support reserves behind. Under normal conditions, that structure could absorb ferocity and answer with coordination. But the Mapuche did not seek the kind of battle the Incas were trained to dominate. They sought chaos. That single word explains almost everything. They crashed into the line with brutal speed and irregular violence. They did not try to out-discipline the Empire. They tried to make discipline unusable. In close, bloody, hand-to-hand combat, the Inca advantages shrank dramatically. Mapuche warriors wielded hardwood maces that could crush skulls, spears strong enough to pierce quilted cotton armor, and more importantly, a style of fighting untethered from imperial order. The Inca soldiers fought for command, state tribute, and the will of the Sapa Inca. The Mapuche fought for land freedom and the right not to kneel before anyone. That difference is not romantic decoration. It has operational consequences. Men fighting to preserve a system can be shaken when the system breaks. Men fighting to stop submission can continue, even when everything around them becomes messy. And messy was exactly what the Toki wanted. The river itself amplified the disaster. With half the Inca force still crossing, the army was physically divided at the worst possible moment. Those already over were under direct assault. Those still in the water or on the northern bank could not help effectively without exposing themselves and worsening the congestion. Then came the second part of the Mapuche plan. Another force struck the army still on the north bank from the flank. Suddenly, the Incas were not merely under attack. They were split, attacked from two fronts, and deprived of the one thing their numbers should have guaranteed: concentration. A larger army that cannot concentrate is often just a larger set of targets. The transcript says the mall ran red for hours. Whether literal or stylized, the image preserves the right battlefield truth. The fight became slaughter at the crossing point. Bodies in water magnify panic. Men see comrades swept, trampled, or pinned in current, and fear accelerates faster than orders. Topa Yupanqui, watching from elevated ground, understood for the first time in his military life that he was not merely struggling. He was losing a full battle to an enemy he had entered the region expecting to subdue. His choice was brutal: reinforce the disaster and risk the army itself, or retreat and preserve what remained. He chose withdrawal. It was the only rational decision left. The surviving Inca troops recrossed the river in disorder. The Mapuche pursued to the shore but did not cross. That restraint is one of the smartest details in the whole account. They did not need to chase the enemy into uncertain ground. They had already accomplished the strategic aim of the moment. The message had been delivered exactly where it needed to be delivered. This is the line. This far your empire comes. That is not only a tactical victory, it is a psychological frontier laid down in blood. The Incas suffered devastating casualties, thousands dead, thousands wounded, morale broken. But perhaps more damaging than all of that was confusion. Topa Yupanqui established camp north of the Maule, sent messengers to Cusco, and tried to understand what had happened. Empires can survive losses.
Show me.
They struggle more when reality violates the categories through which they normally read war. The Mapuche, for their part, celebrated without illusion. They understood what empires do after defeat. They come back. They raise more men. They reframe failure as temporary friction. So they prepared. More alliances, more training, more warriors brought into readiness. That is the mark of a politically intelligent warrior culture. Winning one battle is not mistaken for winning the war. And the transcript is right, the war had only begun. Topa Yupanqui was not the kind of commander to accept one defeat as final judgment. He analyzed, reorganized, brought reinforcements from Cusco, gathered more provisions, drew in more experienced officers, studied the terrain, and prepared a second campaign. This time, he would not underestimate the enemy. This time, he would not cross carelessly into a trap. This time, the Empire would answer cunning with method. A year later, the second offensive began. The Incas crossed the Mall at a different point where the river was wider but shallower. That matters. Topa was adapting. He expected attack. He crossed in defensive formation. He established a fortified camp on the southern shore, built palisades, dug trenches, and made sure the army would not be caught half-formed in the same way again. This is the moment where the war shifts from one great ambush to something strategically deeper. The first campaign failed because Imperial confidence outran caution. The second would test whether caution alone was enough. The Mapuche saw immediately that it would not be possible simply to repeat the first victory. The camp was too well prepared. The army was too alert. So the Toqui changed methods. Instead of hurling warriors against prepared positions, the Mapuche began a war of attrition. Night raids on patrols, ambushes on supply roads, strikes against small groups that strayed from the camp. This is another decisive shift. The Mapuche were not just brave, they were adaptive. They understood that resistance is not loyalty to one tactic, it is loyalty to one objective. The objective was still the same: prevent sustainable occupation. The landscape now became their ally in a slower, crueler way. Every hill, valley, and forest became a hiding place, a route, a blind angle. The Incas were on foreign ground. That fact sounds simple until you understand what it means operationally. It means every movement costs more in uncertainty. Every supply line lengthens fear. Every foraging party becomes bait. Casualties no longer come by thousands in one day. They come by 10 here, 20, there 50, in a well-executed ambush. Those numbers look small to empires used to counting in mass formations. But this is how occupation rots. Men begin to fear leaving camp. They fear dusk. They fear the tree line. They fear roads that seem empty. Over time, a disciplined army can become strategically paralyzed, not because it lost a great battle, but because it has learned that every ordinary activity now carries invisible cost. Topa Yupanqui tried repeatedly to force the Mapuche into a decisive engagement. He marched the bulk of the army into their territory, searching for the main enemy. The Mapuche refused the gift. They withdrew into forests and hills, avoided frontal combat.
The trees hide them, but we will not be denied.
Then reappeared the moment the Incas withdrew, tired and frustrated, striking rear guards and isolated men. The empire was now being dragged into a war for which its methods were not naturally suited. This is where stalemate appeared, and stalemate for an empire can be more dangerous than defeat. Defeat can be narrated as an exception. Stalemate suggests a limit. The transcript says months passed with the Inca army south of the Maule, unable to advance more than a few kilometers. That is a devastating sentence in military history. A force built to conquer in weeks had been reduced to creeping through hostile country at the pace of uncertainty.
This trip again, we gain nothing. The keeper holds our loss.
And then pressure arrived from elsewhere. News from Cusco, unrest in the north, rebellions subject peoples sensing weakness. This is the second strategic trap of frontier war. An empire is never only fighting the enemy in front of it. It is fighting all those behind it who are watching to see whether the center still deserves obedience.
While leveraging unrest in the north to enforce obedience. The routes reveal the dual fronts, calculated risk to win the frontier war.
Topa now faced an uglier question than any posed on the battlefield. Stay obsessed with conquering the south, while the rest of the empire begins to fray, or admit the unthinkable, that the empire has a boundary. His decision was pragmatic and humiliating at once. He withdrew in good order, crossed back over the Maule, fortified the north bank, and effectively accepted a limit. The tacit message was plain: this far we came. We will not cross again, but you do not cross north either. The Mapuche accepted because conquest had never been their objective. Freedom had.
Our armed clans will hold our own bank without high-crossing shields in the wet mud. We are ready.
That should already have been enough to make their story unique. A people without a state had halted the greatest empire in South America. But the transcript goes farther, and rightly so. It shows that even after Topa Yupanqui accepted the Maule frontier, he did not concede morally. The empire tried slower methods, settlement buffer populations, cultural pressure, trade, long patience. Some neighboring groups accepted imperial integration and became a cushion between Inca and Mapuche lands. The border stabilized. Topa returned to Cusco, crushed northern rebellions, and expanded elsewhere. Yet the scar remained. Under Huayna Capac, the last great Inca emperor, the empire reached even greater heights. Roads, millions of subjects, huge territory, the apex of state capacity. And yet he too looked south and wondered whether he would be the one to finish what his father had failed to finish. That is how frontiers haunt empires. A limit becomes a challenge to identity. So Huayna Capac launched a third campaign this time, with more than 50,000 warriors, the best commanders, the strongest logistics, and a new strategy. He would not seek one decisive battle. He would seek gradual control through fortification. This was brilliant in theory. Build pucaras, stone fortresses at intervals, garrison them permanently, connect them with roads, transfer loyal populations, establish agricultural support, turn frontier into structure. As the transcript notes, it resembles a Roman frontier strategy developed independently across the ocean. The first fortresses went up without major resistance. The Incas advanced methodically north of the mall, then sought to extend southward. But once again, the Mapuche refused the battle the Empire wanted. They did not assault the fortresses head-on. They attacked everything else. Roads, caravans, fields, worker groups, supply chains. In doing so, they transformed every fortress into an isolated island in hostile land. This is one of the most sophisticated strategic choices in the entire war. Fortresses are only strong if they are connected. Cut the connections and stone becomes a trap. Garrisoned men began to starve. Rescue columns arrived only to create more mouths. Some relief attempts were ambushed. Some strong points had to be evacuated. Others died trying to withdraw. This was less dramatic than the first river slaughter, but perhaps more humiliating. It proved that even when the Empire anticipated resistance, improved methods, and invested massively, it still could not sustain occupation in Mapuche country. That is where I'll stop part 1, because the next movement is where the story becomes even more extraordinary. Huayna Capac, recognizing the obvious and negotiating with Mapuche leaders not as conquered subjects, but as equals. The border at the Maule hardening into an admitted imperial limit. The stunning irony of the Spanish later destroying the Inca Empire in 1532, with fewer than 200 men under Francisco Pizarro, only to march south believing the Mapuche would be trivial. The rise of Pedro de Valdivia.
The Inca boundary is broken. We advance. Santiago.
Then Lautaro, the destruction at Tucapel on December 25th, 1553, and the long arc by which the people who stopped the Incas would also stop the Spanish for centuries.